In this lesson, we're going to be talking about anger angles. Anger often gets a really undeserved bad rap as a destructive prelude to aggression. And Frederick Tracy, an early pioneer in psychology, had a different view. He saw anger as a force which education should direct and not annihilate. So the problem with anger lies in its abuse. So we're going to look at two examples of anger. In the first one, you're going to see a parent beating a child for crying, and then feel a protective sense of anger. In the second example, you're going to misplace your keys and look for someone else to blame and throw a tantrum. We want to think of these examples of two sides of a coin. On one side of the coin, you find a natural anger. It's really a mobilizing force against a threat. It's a pushback emotion against unfairness and inequity. It's an expression of dominance. We show natural anger to control another person's adverse behaviors. You don't need words to express natural anger. It's been around for over 200,000 years, before the days of language as we know it. On the opposite side of the coin is parasitic anger. This form of anger acts like a parasite. It drains your mental and emotional resources. And this anger is an automatic response to some sort of triggering event that has very little to do with surviving or thriving or building friendships or pretty much anything else that's positive. So how do we liberate ourselves from this parasitic anger? Well, today we're going to be talking about a few of these things. We're going to do a survey for skills that you want to improve upon or develop that apply to lessening that needless anger. We're also going to consider 9 anger factors, 4 main purposes that anger serves, and some solutions to handling anger emergencies, and some tested ways to quell the harmful forms of anger before things really get out of hand. And that's going to include 3 primary levels for change. So the problem with anger lies not in its existence, but rather in the difficulties in controlling and directing it and limiting it to its proper function. While not properly disciplined, it is going to introduce disorder and pain into the mental life. But anger is the most complex and controversial of the different primal emotions, and it's often the most dreaded emotion, mainly because of the aggressiveness, the intimidation, the violence, and the hostility, or the ill will and the unpleasantries that commonly are associated with it. So in 2017, there was an American Psychological Association stress survey, and 35% of the people responding reported irritability and anger as a result of stress as a problem. And 7.8% of those reported outbursts of aggressive actions like yelling or hitting or throwing objects. So if anger is a problem for you, where do we start to get a handle on what we can do? So I'm going to lead you in doing a survey that can help you to identify some areas that apply to overcoming your parasitic anger. You can also find all of these handouts for all of our lessons on this website here. It's going to make you make an account, but the account is free, and then you can download the workbook. So I want you to take a few moments to look over this, pause the video, look at each one of these things, and I want you to write down which of these things you feel like you might want to work on. And this survey doesn't cover every conceivable anger angle, but it does apply to what we are going to cover in our lessons, and it's going to help you to identify some important areas for you to concentrate on. So when you come to a statement that sounds like a skill that you would like to advance, write it down. And before we dive into how we're going to reduce our anger, it's going to be important to identify what are your reasons for doing that. So I want you to take a few minutes, just pause here and give this some thought. Why do I want to reduce my anger? What are your incentives for attacking this parasitic anger problem? So an example here might be like, what painful consequences are you trying to avoid? Avoiding pain is a positive. What do you hope to gain? Achieving a healthy result is positive. So I want you to write down 3 main incentives for breaking a parasitic anger pattern on your paper. Seeing things in writing like this can sometimes strengthen your incentives to act. Now let's look a little bit more closely at the natural and parasitic sides of the anger coin. So while natural anger, you're going to feel aroused to meet a threat. Your sympathetic nervous system charges your body with hormones, and then you're going to go on the offense. Your focus narrows on the external triggers of anger because that's efficient when you face danger. Parasitic anger evoking beliefs like I have to be in control, or I must be smarter than everybody, or the world should comply with my wishes. They give meaning to the situations that evoke them, and that gives them really the power to trigger and amplify the anger feelings. And also the aggressive actions when somebody threatens those ego beliefs. Anger is not really this externalized emotion of just going against something or somebody. Most accept reality for what it is, or what they believe that they see, without realizing that we all orchestrate our own experiences from within ourselves. That's because we all have different beliefs, different cultures, different backgrounds, different parents. We grew up in different places. We've had different experiences. So we're all going to orchestrate our experience from within ourselves. So, like, for example, blame is normally an externalizing belief that can evoke anger when the blame extends into condemnation. So you blame another driver for driving too slowly, and that justifies running the driver off the road. And you suppress that anger by trying to bury the emotion for fear of the social consequences, or fear of retaliation, like if you express the anger, or maybe fear of losing control, maybe believing it's impolite to express anger. And you also turn the anger against yourself when you're hypercritical, or you blame yourself for every imperfection. Anger really co-occurs with, and it adds to the severity of any down moods or anxiety or other unpleasant states. Anger precedes or prolongs or amplifies the misery of depression. But the good news is that when we lessen the anger, we reduce the depression and the anxiety when those 3 conditions merge together. Anger really just tends to impede your memory. It causes you to remember fewer details. And this loss can place limits on the information that you have in your memory for self-correction. High intensity anger narrows your ability to assess complex situations. So higher levels of anger are really a perfect storm condition for repeating this parasitic anger pattern and gathering more poor results every time. And we know that we can be angry without being hostile. So, for example, if we're physically attacked, we might angrily strike back. And this protective action, it's normal, it's functional, but it's temporary. Hostility is this lingering, bitter, vengeful feeling that's fused with thoughts to cause harm. So it's more of an attitude. Hostility includes antagonistic acts and pleasure at other people's misery. So a natural anger towards another person's hostility is normally appropriate. Anger, however, is an emotion. So hostility is the attitude, anger is an emotion. Aggression is a behavioral expression of anger or hostility that comes in different forms. So a natural protective action against a threat. An act to intentionally cause harm to other people, or an intimidation act to gain benefits. So again, anger is the emotion, aggression is the behavior, and hostility is the attitude. So aggression, especially aggression that's blinded by hostility and advanced by rage, is a red flag. Aggression is an impulse to hurt, often with very little, if any, reflection. On the other hand, assertiveness is more of a reflective judgment about a situation and about doing just enough to bring about the change that you want without needlessly harming others. So it's important to understand these 9 factors and how they apply to your own anger as you're proceeding on this journey to reduce your anger. And it's also important to look at anger from different views. And when you think of anger, you might think of how people look or how they posture themselves and the timbre and the tone of speech connected to the emotion. But are you thinking stereotypically? You can also find variability between people in their social expressions of anger. In fact, some people smile when they're angry, and the same person may show variations in anger expression over the course of the same situation. Context, of course, is important. So we know that anger is complex, and anger can be a signal, or it can be a symptom, it could be a protection, or it could even be a problem habit. So we're going to explore those 4 views. Anger signals for other people to back off. So like the facial expressions of anger, the posturing, the vocal tones, this emphasizes that intent. And about 200,000 years ago, anger signals served another purpose. If your group was threatened by a predator or another group and you perceived that fight was better than flight, then you'd emit an anger signal, which would then alert the others to gather and defend. So anger co-occurs with depression about 50% of the time. And it's common among those with social anxiety or general anxiety and also with shame. And anger can be a symptom of hunger. It can be a symptom of a lack of sleep or the onset of the flu and so on. So the challenge is kind of to read the signal right and then address the problem. An aroused anger is a biologically charged state to advance against a threat. And anger can also drive someone to correct an inequity to protect a vulnerable person from harm. And some form of anger, like parasitic anger, it reflects negative patterns of thought that's aroused in situations that you view as unacceptable hassles, or maybe that challenge your ego, or violations of your expectations, and so on. And these conditions of the mind are close to the surface of your awareness, but they elude detection. So they're going to go on until you make them conscious and you alter their automatic course. And researchers who study anger, they use labels like anger in and anger out to refer to the direction of anger. We use trait and state to refer to the inborn tendency for excess anger versus anger that's more like situational. So these anger labels are useful if you plan to research an anger area. But here's the big issue. If you're inclined to lessen the stresses and the strains and the fallout from the excess anger, what do we do? If we have social anxiety and we dread other people judging us, you may anger yourself because you think other people are thinking wrongly of yourself. And these anger defenses are going to show up in other ways too. So to feel comfortable and in control, you're going to demand conformity from other people. So who's in charge of changing your way of coping? So in the beginning stages of change, you're likely to have your share of anger emergencies. So let's look at some of the startup coping methods that to kind of contain the different forms of parasitic anger. And we're going to start with the walking solution. So to discover how this walking solution works, we're going to learn about Dan and how he's using this approach. So on his way home from his job, Dan starts to feel his anger temperature rising up. He's feeling flushed. He's got tense muscles, a quickened heartbeat. What's going on here? His day didn't go so perfectly. He had a lot of problems to solve, and other people took him for granted and thought that he was going to solve the problems. And this was the same way every day. And Dan thought that he didn't get the respect and the appreciation that he deserved or that he should have from some ungrateful customers and also from his boss who took his skills for granted. And so as he's nearing home, his thoughts then switch to his wife and kids. And so he's thinking, yeah, they take me for granted. Like, I'm just their meal ticket. And he regularly defaults to this line of thinking. And as had been going on for years, Dan enters his home in this like frighteningly angry mood. And he sees toys on the floor, so he yells at the kids, pick that crap up or it's going in the trash. Then he turns to his wife and he yells at her. He says, why isn't my dinner on the table? And if he didn't find toys on the floor, or if it was something else, he would find something else to yell at. So the TV was too loud, the kids weren't studying enough, his wife could learn a thing or two about dressing right. About a half hour after that daily anger tirade, he's going to start to calm down. He felt guilty, and so he swears to himself, I'm not going to do that again. It was well-meaning, but it was a false promise. So Dan's wife comes to a breaking point, and one day, with this just unusually strong determination in her voice, she says, you know what? Whatever your problems are, they're not with us. So you need to deal with them, or there's not going to be any more us. So he and his wife then had a talk about his anger, and they had talked about it before. And this time, Dan knew that she really meant business. And so Dan's incentive for change was to spare his family from the abuse at his own hands. And also, obviously, to preserve his relationship with the people that he loves the most. And that was a really strong incentive for him. So the walking solution is a simple startup method to kind of buy some time and think things through. So you just take a 15-minute walk and separate the different physical parts of your anger sensations. And then you're going to log what you're thinking and identify the thoughts that are fusing with the angry feelings. So the next time that Dan has a tough day at work, he used that walking solution. He took a 15-minute walk before he entered the house. And during that walk, he answered 3 key questions that kind of come up with this 3-step to-do list with explanations and results. So in the first 5 minutes of his walk, Dan's going to make himself aware of his physical feelings. So his muscular tightness, his beating heart, whatever other physical sensations are coming up. So by separating the different physical factors in his aroused state of anger, he's finding that none of these are so burdensome that he has to act to get rid of any of them. And psychologist Knight Dunlap in 1949 observed that when people were asked to describe how they feel, they generally respond by describing what they're thinking. So Dan took Dunlap's advice. So in the next 5 minutes, he just took out a notepad and recorded down his angry thoughts. And he made a connection between his thoughts and his angry feelings. And he mainly thought, I don't get enough respect. And so then Dan thought about what it meant if someone didn't actually act respectfully toward him. And so his answer was, you know what? You can't win them all. Then he asked himself if he had a hard day at work, how was his family responsible for that? And then he kind of gets a little bit of insight here. What he was thinking about his work had nothing to do with his family, and so he was bringing his work problems home. So he used that 15-minute walk to buy time in a different place to think things through. And then in a little over a week, he starts to notice a calming change in his thinking. So he enters his home in this slightly better frame of mind. And after about 3 weeks of using this walking solution, Dan no longer rode this like raging bull of anger through the door. And he walks into his house with a smile and a really pleasant greeting, and he finds that his family is actually happy to see him. And so this 15-minute walk technique was really a practical tool that served a very limited but important purpose for him. Dan still had an anger problem that was related to his work, but for now, he resolved his priority anger problem. So your anger can go from like barely noticeable to a blind rage. So how do we explain this variation? Sometimes you're going to think broadly, and sometimes you're going to think parasitically, and your focus is going to narrow when you do that. And your biology is going to influence how you think. So like, for example, poor sleep quality is going to affect your judgment, or you may have a temperamental bent towards anger. But regardless of the causes and the reasons for the forms and degrees of your anger, you can directly dial down the parasitic anger at a practical, an empirical, and a core level. So if you feel this swell of anger, you think you might be heading for trouble, what are your options here? So at a practical level, you're going to use common sense techniques that, maybe wise friends may have advised, or simple techniques that are supported by science, or approaches that you observe as successful and effective people doing advantageously. So maybe a friend might suggest taking a walk around the block, or getting a cup of coffee at a local coffee joint, maybe counting to 100, or just use your cell phone to call a friend and talk things out. So we're going to talk about the 3 research-supported practical experiments for you to try. And the first experiment puts anger and relaxation into a competition. And then the second is a longer-term experiment that you can kind of do at your own pace. And the third is a thought-counting technique. So you probably heard the phrase lean back and relax. So when we sit at an angle rather than upright, it induces relaxation. So you can do this experiment at any time, like even right now. When the next time you feel stressed or you feel angered, just sit back at like a 30-degree angle for about 5 minutes. And at the end of that time, just take a note. Does your body feel more relaxed? So you want to test this sitting back technique 5 different times and use a chart to record your results. On each of the 5 trials, just check the column that best describes the results that you obtained. So you can use this chart right here to record whether you felt more relaxed or more stressed and angry when you practice this lean back and relax thing. But you want to give it at least 5 tries to see if it's going to work for you. So your homework for this lesson is to practice leaning back and relaxing and record whether you felt more relaxed or stressed and angry. And you can also answer these questions. What did you learn? How can you use this information for self-improvement? And I've provided you with an example here. So, what did you learn and how can this information be used for self-improvement? This person said, I noticed less tension in my back. I found that my life goes smoother when I have a relaxing alternative to anger. So it's your turn now to describe what you learned from your 5 trial experiment. So you're going to write your responses on your own sheet of paper.